very fortunate to have Professor Roy come back to give another talk that he was so interesting in the series last year. Professor Roy was born in India and received his undergraduate education there. Then he went to some place where the climate was a lot different, Rochester, New York, and got his doctorate at the University of Rochester. And then he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Joint Institute of Laboratory Physics in Boulder, Colorado. He first became a faculty member at Georgia Tech. Fortunately, he moved to the University of Maryland after that and did College Park, where he's now director of the Institute for Physical Science and Technology and also a professor of physics. His research interests include optics, nonlinear dynamics, synchronization, and complex systems. He's advised or co-advised 30 or more doctoral students, and his recent research interests are now include the area of neuroscience, and he's working with some scientists at NIH. He's had a couple of courses at the University of Maryland, and one of them is a semester-long honors seminar called Faith and Science, and so he's got a lot of interest in this area, and I'd like you to welcome Professor Roy.
Thank you very much for inviting me back and for making all these arrangements and for coming out this morning. And I hope I will have something to say that won't bore you too much. But I want to mention that one of the connections that I have with Lutherans is through a graduate student who came to me several years ago at the University of Maryland. His name is Carl Schmidt.
Yes.
And Carl became one of the students that I started advising. And so I'm one of his advisors. He works also with Jim York, who is one of the founders of chaos theory, and he works with Michel Gervin, who is a pioneer in the area of networks. And he worked with me, and he is going to defend his thesis on the 16th of April. He's very excited about that. I just received his thesis in final form from him last evening.
Wow. So that's why he's not here.
So I understand fully why he's not here. But Carl is a really interesting guy. He's very active and does all full of energy and all sorts of ideas. And I'm very glad to learn also that he will be teaching at a Lutheran University, Valparaiso University in Indiana. And he's gotten a job there, so he's on his way to doing things. Now, why did I give you this title, Rhyme or Reason, Balancing Our Checkbooks, Our Lives in the Scientific Method? It's because maybe for some period of my life, I was totally uncertain about whether I wanted to be a poet or a radio repair person. Those were my two things that I was very interested in when I was growing up. And poetry somehow resonated with me, but I was totally hopeless at writing it. But I really appreciated the rhythms of poetry, of cadences of words and things like that. And at the same time realized that the use of words has to be done carefully in poetry, because you have to choose your words very, very cautiously and carefully, but some people have a great gift and talent from God for doing that. And I had a talent for appreciating it, but maybe not so much for doing it. On the other hand, I also started to understand the structures that reason and logic put into our lives. Our lives would be completely wild if we didn't have these structures to put us in some kind of framework that helped us lead our lives in a rational and interesting way that would be perhaps for the common good, or perhaps to listen to what God is willing us to do in our lives. That includes reason. That includes poetry. All of these things together. So I wanted to ask you one question first. What is one of the first pieces of scripture that you all might have memorized?
23rd Psalm.
The 23rd Psalm, right?
In the air.
Right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He leads me beside quiet pastures, green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will have no fear, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me before my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. How does it go after that? Anybody
Surely
remember?
goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life.
And
And I
this
will
is,
dwell in
this
the
is
house
what
of
I
the Lord
wanted to
forever.
bring up. I had not forgotten that, but I wanted to see how you remember these things, right? Surely God will let us stay with him all the days of our lives, and we shall dwell in his house forever, in the presence of his love and mercy upon us. And this is so poetic. There's so much poetry in this that it just draws us to it in a way that few other things do. Okay. There's a natural resonance within our beings that happens when we hear these words, when we conjure up these images of the green pastures, the quiet waters, of God preparing this table for us before our enemies, anointing our heads with oil. All of these things just draw up images in our mind's eye. Just the way Wordsworth did when he wrote his poem, which is read by all 7th graders probably, Daffodils. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on higher vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, right? What else conjures up in our minds and in our hearts this beauty, this wonderful idea of oneness with nature, with God? When oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. Then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. Right? I mean, it is just so magical to hear these cadences and rhythms and these words put together with these ideas. It's absolutely beautiful. Okay. Now, when we come to the nature that we see around us, all around us on this beautiful spring day, we are seeing the bloom starting to happen. We want to understand as deeply as we can what is going on. Why are these flowers starting to bloom at this time? What makes them? What makes all the plants and trees realize that it's about time to start doing this? The wonder and beauty that we see all around us is something that is absolutely captivating. And I think that science began from that sense of wonder in humankind. It started with us wondering about nature, about ourselves, about the stars, about where we live. All of that stirred up in us this curiosity, this wanting to know. Knowledge as distinguished from ignorance or misunderstanding, okay? All of those things somehow budded within us and started to bloom a few hundred years ago. Not that long ago, it's quite amazing how recent it is that the scientific awakening or enlightenment or reformation started to happen. It's not that long ago, but it has made enormous strides, and a whole body of methods or techniques started to come about, which we now call the scientific method, for investigating phenomena all around us, for acquiring knowledge, for correcting. This is all from Wikipedia. Our new source of all wisdom and knowledge. Okay? And the Oxford English Dictionary defines the scientific method as a method or procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurement, and experiment, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. Now, the question, of course, here is, what do you observe? What do you measure? It doesn't tell you that. Right? So we have to choose. As human beings, we have to select the problems that we're going to work on. What are we going to look at? What are we going to measure? What is the experiment going to be? We don't know. Okay? And that's where, yes.
So you're differentiating between science and technology?
Yes.
Okay, because I was thinking thousands of years ago,
Yes.
we were able to do a lot more than tens and tens of thousands of years ago, but
Yes.
it's not the scientific method.
Right.
Okay,
So I'm differentiating between science and technology. In fact, the place that I'm a director of is called the Institute for Physical Science and Technology. And it's very interesting that we really focus mostly on the science part of things and not so much on the technology. That is often done in the engineering part of a campus. And we do have some engineers to keep us sort of
Keep you honest.
but a lot of what we actually focus on is the science, the curiosity part of things, doing things even though sometimes it may seem like there is absolutely no rhyme or reason to do it, apart from curiosity. Okay?
Which department is it that's doing this experiment with the helicopter that has to be manually?
That's aerospace engineering.
Oh, okay.
Yes, the Gamera,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
is, yes, that's the aerospace engineering department in the engineering school, the human-powered helicopter.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. But we have to know what we're going to observe, what we're going to measure, and what experiments we're going to do. And one of the things that I want to tell you about that is completely current and recent is the discovery over the past few decades that has most mystified scientists, perhaps, is that we really know only a very small fraction of the universe is visible to us. We don't see the rest of it. We have no idea what the majority of the universe is. We just don't know it. And that ignorance is profound. We call that part of the universe that we have no knowledge of, we call it dark matter and dark energy. The last 20 years or so has seen a huge set of scientists starting to explore what they can about dark matter and dark energy, which they cannot observe, make no measurements of by any means that are direct, okay? And yet, they know from the observations of how the galaxies are receding, how the expansion of the universe is taking place, that they can measure, that they can observe, but they don't know what is causing it. So they postulate that there is this stuff which makes up the majority of the universe, okay? A vast majority. People really don't know exactly how much, but there are estimates. Dark matter makes up about 70%. Dark energy makes up about 83%. I don't know the numbers exactly offhand. They change all the time because people are re-estimating these things. And that's part of the provisional nature of science and the scientific method. is that we constantly reevaluate, we look at new evidence, and we start to make estimates over and over and over again. What is the age of the universe? How old is the Earth? Okay, we don't know exactly, but we are trying to make measurements more and more precise and trying to see what nature tells us about all this. So just yesterday was the first paper. It's been cited in the press a few times before this, New York Times, Washington Post, everywhere, but a group has claimed that they have seen the first signs, possibly, not confidently, not surely, but possibly, of dark matter. Evidence of dark matter that they have been able to detect with a $2 billion detector that was sent up on the space station 2 years ago by NASA. It is called the Alpha Magnet Spectrometer. And there are people from my institute and the University of Maryland who are involved in this experiment. Unsuk So and Rual Savdev are two of our institute faculty who are involved in this experiment. The paper has just appeared yesterday, and I actually have a copy of it here for anyone who would want to see it.
All the authors.
Yes, look at all the authors. Okay, so it's sort of fun to see how science is being done, and the scientific method is leading us towards current knowledge about the universe and what is happening around us. Okay, now, what is a scientific theory? Scientific method means we observe, we measure, we confirm, we iterate, and change our understanding. What is scientific theory? Something that's repeatedly confirmed through observation and experiment. It's based on a body of knowledge that is like that. But a scientific theory is something that involves a hypothesis. Something that we conjecture. We don't know exactly what that is, but we conjecture something. And then we make a falsifiable prediction based on that hypothesis. And we say, okay, if this hypothesis is true, then we should be able to see such and such. Let's go look for it. And so we are taught all of these steps of the scientific method, of what is scientific theory, what constitutes a scientific model. We are taught these things in undergraduate, in high school, undergraduate school, graduate school, and so on. But all of this would go nowhere if we didn't have an idea of what problems to select, what to study. Okay, how to enlarge the realm of measurements and observations that we can make on nature, on physical systems, on biological systems, on any kind of system, social systems, economic systems, okay? We wouldn't have a clue what to do, what to conclude if we didn't have a sense of where to go, what problems to select. What tells us
We
that?
don't know what we need to know.
We don't know what we need to know. This is the first thing to admit to ourselves and to others. We do not know what we need to know, okay? But we know that things that we learn today, even if we have no use for them today, they might be very interesting and useful years later. We don't know. Okay. People began wondering about why we are here a long time ago. Way before science really evolved the scientific method, we started wondering about where we come from, why we are here, the question, who am I, who are we? Those questions started to intrigue people from a long time back. And in the book of Genesis, and God created man in his or her own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Then he blesses them, saying, be fruitful, multiply, subdue it, earth and that which is in it. And this we read in Genesis. And the creation of humans. First thing that happens before all of this is that there's a garden, and God places us in it. And humankind is meant to work and take care of the garden. So we see our purpose in life enumerated over there. Okay? It's to take care of the garden. We're gardeners. And I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a marvelous little remix of Mr. Rogers that you can look up on YouTube. It's about the garden of the imagination. And what happens when you plant things in the garden of your imagination? They grow and they bloom later on. It's a beautiful little 2-minute clip, and I have it on my computer for anyone who wants to see it afterwards. Okay. Now, one of the great mysteries to me as a human being is, why are there so many religions in the world? Why aren't we all Christians or Hindus or Muslims or Buddhists or whatever? Why are there so many different religions? And the greatest segment, the fastest growing, the biggest segment is Christianity. This is a segment that's rapidly growing, Islam. And this one is the most rapidly growing of all, non-religious. Agnostic, atheist, it's 16%, that was a few years ago, it's closer to 20% now. Okay. It's very interesting to see what the demographics of the different religions of the world looks like. And I have a map for you later on about that. The Pew Research Forum published in December of 2012 the latest global map of the religions of the world. It's very interesting to see. I will show it to you
But a
later.
lot of people in that non-religious category will insist that, oh, well, we believe in God, we're spiritual, but not religious. They'll differentiate, they think of religion as a systematic organization of some kind, and they don't want to be part of that.
Half of this group is theistic,
Yeah,
but
okay.
non-religious.
Yeah, didn't read the whole thing.
Yeah. Half of that is like that, in fact.
So that's a mission field.
Right? It's amazing how this has been happening. Now, I have a few slides here about different religions, but I'm not going to bore you with those. But if anybody wants to take a look at them later, they sort of summarize all the different major 6 religions of the world. But I won't drag you through all of these things. I will just mention that when I teach my Faith in Science seminar, or I am taught by it, I actually use this wonderful book by Houston Smith. I don't know how many of you have seen this. It's a book written over 20 years ago, but it has actually, it's still widely in circulation, and it has one of the best, very pithy sort of set of synopses about each of the major world religions in it. If you want to read it, it's very interesting to see that as you read each chapter of this, you feel, well, maybe Houston Smith is a Hindu, or Houston Smith is a Muslim, or he's a Buddhist, or he's a Christian. Each section kind of really wants you to look at the best of each tradition. Each tradition has a lot of flaws which are human. Human beings are not perfect. In each religious tradition, in each faith tradition, there have been enormous problems, conflicts, difficulties. Houston Smith doesn't focus on those things. There are plenty of books written about those kinds of things. Here he tries to focus really on what is important, what is beautiful, what is best about each of these traditions. And this book was written by a philosopher and religious studies scholar at Boston University, Stephen Prothero, and he calls it God is Not One. And he sort of based it off of this one. He said, Houston Smith only sees the good things about the world, I see all the problems. And so he took this book and wrote it based on all the different problems that each of the religions sees, which are different from each other, and you can't read this very much, so I'll read it to you. In Hinduism, he says, the problem is suffering and the cycle of birth and death. The solution, he takes a very engineering approach to life, in other words, and he says, how do you solve this problem? In Judaism, the problem is exile. The solution is to return to God through prayer and observance of the commandments. In Christianity, the problem is sin or separation from God. The solution is atonement or salvation through Christ, the guidance of the Holy Spirit and God's grace in our lives. So he does this kind of exercise with the different religions, and that's what that book is all about. It's pretty interesting perspective and concept. But here's the map that I was telling you about from the Pew Forum, which shows, if we could see the colors a little bit better, but the green here is Islam. This
China.
unaffiliated China. Yes. Okay. This Christianity, but in different shades. If you actually look at this on a screen where you can really see the shades, you would see the shades, the deepness of the shade tells you how much of a majority that particular religion is in that region. Okay? It's a very interesting majority religion by country map of the world that just came out in December 2012. Okay, so it's a very recent.
That doesn't take into account where it shows China like that. What we hear is that there's a huge underground church there.
But the majority is
Yeah,
unaffiliated.
right.
And that's why they show it that way,
Yeah.
right? So they're only showing the majority affiliations over here. And the numbers are huge in terms of people, coming back to religious roots, sometimes taking on new religions and ideas and so on. And we know that there are many, many underground churches that are really coming alive in China. This is one of my favorite folks, the Dalai Lama. He's going to visit here, I believe, sometime in May, probably is what I was hearing. Our university. Yeah, pretty soon.
I thought you meant he was coming to Hope, and we were gonna
No,
get busy trying to welcome him.
He's actually preaching.
Oh, okay, I love that deal.
He just received the Templeton Prize, and he has been a long-standing advocate of nonviolence and peace around the world. He's a Buddhist, and he's very interested in science. So his book, called The Universe in a Single Atom, The Convergence of Science and Spirituality, is well worth reading. It's a beautiful exposition of his thoughts about science. And he wrote an article in the New York Times called Our Faith in Science, which prompted me to title the seminar that I present to honors students here, Faith in Science. So that's where that comes from. But he says, if science proves some belief of Buddhism wrong, then Buddhism will have to change. in my view, science and Buddhism share a search for the truth and for understanding reality. By learning from science about aspects of reality where its understanding may be more advanced, I believe that Buddhism enriches its own worldview. It's a very interesting, open concept of religion. Religion is a dynamic, living entity. Faith is not fossilized, is how I think of it, okay? It's changing, it's evolving. Faith, our faith changes during our lifetimes. When we were kids, we see things one way. Now that I'm a man, I see things in a different way. Paul said things like that, right? And we have to realize that this is an approach that is really a living approach to faith traditions, to science. Science is the same way. If a new observation proves something wrong, then you have to change your way of thinking. So I'm going to show you a small gadget that I brought with me, which does different things in different ways. So here's this gadget, and it's called a double pendulum. But right now, I'm going to make it a single pendulum, and what you're going to see is what it does. What does it do? It just swings back and forth. It's perfectly predictable. It's not perfectly frictionless, so it's going to stop at a certain point in time. Its energy is going to decay away into heat in the bearings, and it's going to dissipate away into movement of the air around it that it's encountering, and it's going to stop, but it's really quite predictable. I know what it's doing. It's just going to swing back and forth and come to a halt eventually. Okay? Can I write down a scientific model, a mathematical model for this pendulum and predict what it's going to do?
Sure.
Pretty reasonably, pretty well. Okay. I don't have a problem with doing that because it's fairly simple in what it does. Now I'm going to remove these rubber bands and make it what it is truly, a double pendulum. So there's one bearing over here, okay, and another bearing up here. It's a double pendulum. It's two pendulums hooked on together. And now I'm going to see if it works over here. I'm going to let it swing, and you can see what it's doing. It's still doing the same kind of thing that the previous one was, except now there's two parts to it. So it's a little more complicated, but it's still doing it. I'm going to give it more energy now, and let's see what it does.
Oh,
Okay. Many of you may have seen this device before, but what you realize is that not even the most powerful computer in the world can actually predict exactly what it will do 5 seconds from now.
The study of the physics
Yes,
of the pendulum.
yes. Amazing. So you watched a movie about Galileo some time ago?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it.
It's the man who came up with
Little trough with the balls.
that he saw the chandelier in the cathedral that was swinging back and forth and got the idea that you could measure time with a pendulum. And what we realized through this double pendulum is that it can become one of the most complex phenomena that is completely unpredictable, okay? And not even the fastest, best computers in the world can predict what it will do beyond a few swings. It's really astonishing, but it's true. One of the great experts on motion like this is Jim York, who is the chair of the mathematics department here at the University of Maryland. And Jim often goes to talks carrying his double pendulum with him, just to show people that here's a macroscopic large device that with all our science, we cannot predict what it will do. Few seconds hence, okay? So,
Question over here.
yes,
This is probably a diversion, but how does a regular pendulum and a clock deal with friction? How does
so,
it overcome friction?
yes, so you have to have a spring, a source of energy,
Ah,
that keeps feeding in energy to that pendulum, okay? So it overcomes friction by having a source of energy, which could be as simple as a set of weights
okay.
or a spring.
Spring.
Wind-up clocks.
That's why
I used to have a wristwatch that I used to have to wind up every night, you know, that was my first watch that I received. And Christian Huygens was a Dutch scientist who was one of the first people who made reliable pendulum clocks. And there's whole lectures and stories and amazing things about Huygens that I could tell you. But today, what we are going to look at a little bit is that the universe is very complex, as you can see. It's galaxies. This is a picture from the Hubble telescope of space, okay, with galaxies and things, and you can see the spiral nature of the galaxies here.
Some of us saw a lot of that last night. We watched 2001 Space Odyssey.
Absolutely. And 2001 Space Odyssey was 1968 when Stanley Kubrick and Arthur Clarke, you know, collaborated on the movie, and then Clarke actually wrote his novel afterwards.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. There was an essay that he wrote called The Sentinel, I think, on which Kubrick based the movie, but then Clarke actually wrote his novel right after the movie was published. Was made. Okay, so it's very interesting. You can look it all up. But it's, of course, the movie is actually available on YouTube, so you can download it and watch it if you like, for free. But from galaxies, we go to things like trees, which are incredible. Okay, a tree, a large tree, such as any one of these things that we have outside the window, is an amazing entity. Okay, of which we understand barely this little. How does the tree transfer nutrients from the ground to its leaves? How can it overcome this weight of gravity and transport nutrients? You may think this is a problem that scientists know exactly how it does that. We don't. There are people giving talks who are arguing about what are the osmotic forces, what is involved in the transport of the nutrients from the ground up into the leaves. We do not know anything at all about the details of these processes. They're completely up for grabs. There are problems like this everywhere you look. If you look outside and you see a leaf falling down from the tree, what trajectory is that leaf following as it comes through the air? Again, not the most powerful computer in the world can do that calculation and tell you exactly where it's going to land, okay, with any great precision at all, okay? So everywhere you look, there are problems which we do not know the answers to. One of the biggest problems is the human brain, okay? And President Obama has just announced that he's going to put $100 million towards mapping the function and structure of the human brain, right? You've all seen this in the newspapers and so on. And we think we can do this now with some accuracy and some skill. But we're like little kids playing with these things. We have no idea how. No, I shouldn't say that. There have been wonderful neuroscientists who have been working for decades on these problems. the National Institutes of Mental Health and NIH has the Porter Neuroscience Center. I have worked there myself. I have taken a sabbatical to spend a lot of time with neuroscientists, talking to them every day about what we understand and know about the brain. So I collaborate with neuroscientists there. That's one of my more recent interests over the past 6 or 7 years. And what I've really understood after all these years, and I continue to collaborate with them, is that quite often we just know how to name things and observe things. But as for understanding deeper what is going on, how things are happening, we don't know very much at all. Okay? So I'm going to see if I can show you a little bit about the brain and tell you a little story here about signals from the brain. I don't have that much time left, so I'm going to cut things a little bit short, but I have to tell you this story about Hans Berger. I don't know how many of you have heard about Hans Berger, but he was planning to pursue a career in the natural sciences and wanted to become an astronomer. But then he enlisted for a year of military service, and this is in Germany, in 1892. Okay? And one morning, while mounted on horseback and pulling heavy artillery for a military training exercise, Berger's horse suddenly reared, throwing the young man to the ground on a narrow bank just in front of the wheel of an artillery gun. The horse-drawn battery stopped at the last second, and Berger escaped certain death with no more than a bad fright. That same evening, he received a telegram from his father inquiring about his son's well-being. Berger later learned that his older sister in Coburg was overwhelmed by an ominous feeling on the morning of the accident, and she urged their father to contact young Hans, convinced that something terrible had happened to him. He had never received a telegram from his family, and Berger struggled to understand this incredible coincidence based on principles of natural science. How did his sister have this thought that he was in danger? He didn't know. He wanted to figure this out.
They weren't twins.
They weren't twins. So he became the father of the electroencephalograph, the EEG as we know it. But at that time, in the 1920s, 30s, at that time, very few instruments were available. Galvanometers, ballistic galvanometers as they were called, were the most sensitive measurers of electric currents. We didn't know quite what to measure, in other words, what to observe, coming back to our scientific method, okay? But he started to realize that if you put electrodes on the skull, shave the skull, put some conducting grease over there, and attached electrodes over there, maybe you could start measuring electrical signals, which were very weak. But could you do it? And could you do it reproducibly? Could you build a model for this? Was there a scientific theory that you could construct around it? Nothing at that time, right? So he conducted these experiments in great secrecy. He wouldn't tell his colleagues too much about what he was doing because he was worried about the ridicule and the reactions that he would have. But he kept doing it. And the sad part of the story is that in 1941 or thereabouts, he committed suicide. Okay, and that was part of the Nazis' rise and all that. But he today is known as the founder of the principles of electroencephalography, EEGs. And these are my friends at NIH who I work with. So Dietmar Plenz is the head of the group. Hong Yan Yang was a graduate student here at the University of Maryland. Woody Shu was a physics PhD who converted over to being a neuroscientist, and he was the one who got me involved in neuroscience 7 or 8 years ago. And Shan Yu is from China, but trained in Frankfurt on how to make measurements on primates. So he works with awake monkeys, basically, and does measurements on that. So the brain is truly an amazing thing. And I won't tell you too much of detail about this, but I will show you, if I can, a video.
See, I have an idea that maybe the screen will look better if I move one of these screens to that side.
Over there to block the light. Let's see if we can
That's my
see.
hypothesis, Chuck.
Yes.
Yes, it
Yes. Now,
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
interestingly, it is not showing what I'm seeing on my screen up on the screen over here. So I will show this video to you privately, but what I have over here are 32 electrodes that are measuring electrical signals. It's on my screen here, but the projector is somehow not projecting the video, okay? 32 signals that are being measured from a little piece of cortical tissue from the brain of a few days old rat pup. A little rat that was dissected, and tissue from the brain taken and deposited on a multi-electrode array, and then measurements being done on it. And what I'm unable to show you, because this video is not coming on the screen, is the electrical activity that gets generated Let's see. I'll just go on to the next one here. Now, can we see it? No. That is the strangest thing. Okay. Okay, so it's very strange because my screen was showing it, but the projector was not. Okay, so what I wanted to show you...
get lunch, by the way.
Yeah, we can do it later. And what the brain does is very funny things with all the signals. Sometimes we can look at pictures like that. Escher's pictures. And the man who discovered Escher and made him popular was a mathematician. His name is Don Coxeter, and he was a mathematician at the University of Toronto, and he has written one of these landmark books on geometry. But he discovered Escher, and they became great friends, and so he was one of the people who discovered and inspired Escher. And I just want to show you a few things. Our eyes do funny things with, can you look at that and tell me how many black dots there are? They change as you look at them, right? So you realize that what we see is not always what is real. So our devices for observation and measurement are not always as reliable as we think they are. And there's a lot of things that we need to think about more carefully when we look at pictures. Okay. So science and religion both fascinate me. They're both journeys of discovery. We want to figure out the workings of the world. We want to figure out the workings of humanity, okay? We are curious about these things. What do we look at? What do we measure? Both require honesty, imagination, creativity, growth, and a lifelong journey. And we have to undertake this journey whether we like it or not, because we are living human beings, okay? And the more we can enjoy what is around us and all the people we meet and talk to and discuss things with, the more fun and entertaining, as well as informative and growth-inspiring these things become. So I wanted to mention one other thing that I often think about, which is this idea that each one of us is different. We have different gifts. And this book, Understanding Personality Type, and called Gifts Differing, the quotation at the beginning of the book is this. This is the basis of the Myers-Briggs tests that some of you may have heard about. For as we have many members in one body, and all members have not the same office, so we, being many, are one body, and everyone members of one another. We're all part of each other. This is something very beautiful and mysterious that I have been discovering all my life. The more I think of myself as separate from everyone else, the narrower the filters that I put in my brain to isolate myself and reduce myself from what I could be. And Jesus' message to us, I am the vine, you are the branches, brings me back to the tree example. How does Jesus transport these nutrients? He's the vine, right? He transports those nutrients to all of us and reaches every one of us in one way or the other. And when it's time for us, we're a transient phenomenon. Life is transient. We float away like that leaf falling down, and no computer on earth can calculate where it's going to fall. So I think of all these things as beautiful examples. While we're alive, what do we do to balance our lives? So balancing our checkbooks. That was part of my title, okay? So balancing things is arithmetic, right? It's plus and minus. It's very simple numbers that we have to use to balance our lives. Our checkbooks, for example, tell us about what resources we gather and how we use them. There's an input of resources. The university pays my salary every month, right? It's an input of resources. And that gets transformed into energy and matter through the use that I put this money to. The energy that I have every morning when I wake up, what am I going to do with it that day? Who's going to guide me to spend whatever little energy I have that day on activities? What is it that I'm going to do? Okay? Now it's interesting to figure that out, by the way. How much energy do we have to spend in a day? And I give this as a little exercise to my classes sometimes. How many calories do we consume a day in an average American diet?
Like
Anyone know?
2,000 kilocalories.
2,000 kilocalories, right? The important word is kilo over there because it tells us it's 2,000, 2 million calories roughly of the physical measurement, but kilocalories is what we normally measure body intake, food intake in, okay? And that is roughly speaking 3 jelly donuts or 5 jelly donuts, or cream or Dunkin' Donuts, you know, you could get all your 2,000 calories that way. Okay. If you wanted to. But most of us have other ways of getting those calories, okay? But typically, we are expending energy at the rate, if you take that amount of kilocalories as our diet, we're expending about as much energy as a 100-watt light bulb all the time, okay? So that's our energy output. How much of it is consumed by the brain? Notice. A third of it, roughly, is quarter to a third of our total energy intake is consumed by the brain, okay? Even if we don't stir a limb the whole day, if we're awake for roughly 8, 10, 12 hours, we consume a third of our daily intake of energy up here, okay? And part of it is processing images, which is what you did when you watched 2001: Space Odyssey. You processed images, okay? That's what we end up doing all the time. And here's a list of things that Isabel Briggs-Myers thought were good things to be desired in life and to spend your time and energy. She thought to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, was important. To love the human beings that mean the most to us and contribute to their lives if we can. To avoid mistakes that make us regret the past or fear the future. To be involved, to be interested in whatever you are doing, wherever you are going, because God is with you. Wherever you are, God is there. Guiding us, telling us, teaching us every instant. To incorporate the things, people, and ideas that happen to us into a coherent concept of the world. So here I come to my ABC idea. ABC, A is for atoms, B is for bits of information, and C is for coherence, okay? Life is all made of matter, atoms, arranged in patterns, which are bits of information. Bit is the word that we use to measure the atom of information. It's revealed to us through the arrangement of atoms. So the DNA molecules that we have, which contain our genetic information, are arranged in certain sequences. That sequence unfolds as we live in our lives, the genetic information. And we're influenced at the same time by our surroundings. So we develop as coherent, organic, living creatures, subject to our environment. And we are coherent, we can reason, right, through our lives. And then we decohere. So A, B, C, D, right? Our coherence gradually breaks down. Okay? And this can happen with our bodies, with our minds, with our whole being, eventually, gradually decohering and going away, back to the atoms that we came from.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Yes, and who knows where we came from? As you may have heard other people say, some of the atoms that I'm made of were probably part of a different star or a comet at some time. And it's true, okay? It's completely true, okay? So, while we are living, in India, people talk about 4 paths. And these are not separate paths. These are paths that we can follow simultaneously. Okay? The path of devotion to God, to people around us, love God, love your neighbor. How do you do it? With knowledge to guide you, with works and actions to make your love felt around you. And how do you bring all these things together? Through meditation and prayer. Okay. So this is a very ancient set of disciplines that people talked about on how to live while we are here. And yet, these folks realized that you are not your body. The you that's you is not necessarily just your body. Your whole body is not going to remain the same atoms that you have today. In 9 years on the average, every atom that you are made of, Pastor Regan, is going to be a different atom than the one that you have. Okay? And so it is really incredible to understand this, that you are not your body. It's a pattern that exists. Okay? And you are not your mind, because your mind is also that. Okay? It's a whole set of biochemical reactions that are going on, but that's not who you are. And the more I have come to see friends and family who have Alzheimer's or dementia, and they have lost control of their body, they have lost control of their minds, and yet there is something there that is them, way beyond all these external things that are there. And what I want to say is that it's way past my time, so I should end now and have discussions and show you any slides that you want later on. But one of the things I wanted to mention to you right at the end was on the lines of this religious diversity idea that we were talking about earlier. Why are there that many religions around the world? Well, 7 or 8 major religions are just the major ones. There are many, many, many religions. But there's also this. At some point in our early history, we started to have linguistic diversity. Not just religious diversity, but linguistic diversity. And the story here is from Genesis 11. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." Technology, right? And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And that's, of course, what happened to them. They did get dispersed. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do." Okay? And nothing that they propose to do now will now be impossible for them. "Come, let us go down." Who is us? Okay. "Let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the whole earth. The Lord is not very nice.
Why?
Right.
But you have to remember that this is humans writing down what they think the Lord did. Okay? But it's really very, very amazing. It sort of ties in with the story that I skipped over, which is the story of Job. And there, the Lord is equally capricious. And what does the Lord do there? Let's take a look. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. That's what we're told happens. Very arbitrary behavior. We do not know why this happened. What we do know is that Job did not retreat. Even after he lost everything, he persisted in his search for God. And these beautiful passages of poetry, rhyme, not reason, come to us and inform us about his whole approach. And there are two commentaries on Job that I will tell you about today. I have seen many, many others. I have a few others also that I have read. But these two are really interesting. And I brought one of them, I think, with me. And that's in my portable Carl Gustav Jung library. Okay? The Answer to Job is a short book. That's the title. And Jung is scathing in his indictment of God for being a bully. And a really nasty person. Okay? But he says the answer to Job did not arrive during Job's lifetime, but it came much later. And that answer was our Lord Jesus. Okay? Jesus is the answer to Job in the sense that Jesus came to be with us and to be with us through our suffering. Job was not alone when he was suffering. It might have seemed that God was just leaving him completely alone and isolated. But no. Where did he get his persistence from? To search for God. That came from God himself. Jesus comes and is with us through all our suffering at all times. Full of grace and truth. And this is what is the real answer to Job, which comes down through Scripture many years, millennia later. I believe. I think of it that way. Now, I also want to get back to our picture of the Tower of Babel. This is Peter Bruegel the Elder, some artist in the 1500s who drew that. It's a lovely picture. And I think of this linguistic diversity that God created by confusing us. Babel means confusion, okay? And dispersing us all over the world. I think of this as, so here's a picture of the map of the world languages and language groups. It's much more complicated than the religious affiliation picture that I showed you a little while ago, right? So it says there's estimated that 7,000 different languages exist in our world, 90% of which are used by less than 100,000 people. And also there are 46 languages that just have a single speaker at this time, whenever this map was made a few years back. Okay? But I think that the answer to Babel comes to us at Pentecost. So after Easter, we have Pentecost coming up. This is our season right now. And I truly think that this is what the risen Christ did for us with the Spirit, coming to people who spoke different languages, were from every nation under heaven, and they all suddenly understood each other. How does that happen? This is one of these most beautiful passages in the Bible that tells us that there are ways of communicating that are well beyond spoken language. And I think that if I were to sit down with anyone of you, anyone of my family, certainly, I know that for a fact, if I were to sit down with them and I were to talk to them using words and language, within a few minutes we would find huge differences and misunderstandings with each other. There's no question about it. There would be things that you and I would differ on, that my wife and I would differ on, my son and I would fight about, which would happen within minutes or hours or whatever, but a very short time. So language is very limited. But if we can just be in each other's presence, sometimes without words, but in the presence of the Holy Spirit, which is always with us. And I remember Dietrich Bonhoeffer talking about this in a little book called Life Together, where he says that when you are with others, never think that you are just alone with that person. You are in God's presence. Christ is there with you while you are interacting with that other person. Never forget that, because you are in this relationship, never alone. I have found that one of the most amazing things that I read many, many years ago. And I've never been able to put it out of my mind. And it's sort of, what Bonhoeffer says is that make this the infrastructure, the undergirding of your life. Whenever you are with anyone, remember that Christ is present with you. The Spirit is present with you. God is there. And so I'll just end right now, because I've taken up too much of your time telling you about things. But here are 3 little quotes on faith, or 4 little quotes on faith that I really enjoy. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, Hebrews. Faith is the beginning of all good things, that is the Buddha. Martin Luther said, faith is a living, daring confidence in God's grace, so sure and certain that a man could stake his life on it 1,000 times. Okay? And faith is the bird that feels the light when the dawn is still dark. That's from an Indian poet, Tagore, who wrote that. Okay? So I'll end with that. Thank you all so much for being here and for listening and letting me tell you about some of the things that I have been storing up in my heart. I'm thinking about it. Okay.
We have a question and answer session,
Yeah.
if you would
Absolutely.
like.
Yeah, I'm here. Anybody has any thoughts, questions? I'm glad to discuss them. I brought a few other things with me, a few books that are kind of interesting. One of them, since is about this guy, the man who knew infinity. And he's a man of numbers. So his name was Srinivasa Ramanujan. And he was an Indian mathematician who was completely self-taught. He really had no teachers in India, there were no mathematicians. But he thought that God really communicated to him about numbers. Nobody knows how he got these amazing ideas and made these discoveries about mathematics. He died at the age of 32 from tuberculosis. But he was in the hospital and very ill, and his mentor, Hardy was a mathematician at Cambridge. So the story goes that one day Hardy received a letter from India with things written all over it you know, on the sheets of paper, on the outside of the envelope. Things were scribbled everywhere, mathematics. Hardy looked at it and said, this is really crazy. What do I make of this thing? There's 136 or something equations and formulae written in that sheet. And he looked at them and he said, these results, I recognize a few of them here. These seem completely new, but really ingenious. And these I have no idea what they are. And so Hardy, as was his practice, took this letter and gave it to his friend Littlewood, who was also a great mathematician at Cambridge. And Littlewood pondered over all these things for a few days and came back to Hardy and said, you know, either this guy's a genius or he's the biggest fake there ever was. Let's find out. So they wrote back to Ramanujan. And they arranged for Ramanujan to come from India to visit with them in Cambridge. But the path was not easy. So Ramanujan came from a very religious family. And if you were from a religious Orthodox family in India, you were not supposed to cross the ocean in those days. Okay. So he couldn't figure out how he was going to do this, you know, because going to Cambridge involved going on a ship from India to England. And then his mother one day had a dream where she saw a goddess telling her that your son will go and talk to people elsewhere and be influential in mathematics that he so loves. Let him go. With heaven-sent sanction, Ramanujan managed to make his way to Cambridge. He was a strict vegetarian and Hindu Orthodox person, and he fell very ill over there. So he contracted his tuberculosis over there. And while he was in the hospital, one day Hardy came to see him. And this is a very famous incident that has been recounted many times. So Hardy came to see him, and Hardy said, Ramanujan, I took a cab to come to see you, and the cab number was 1729. The flip chart comes in handy. 1729. That's a very boring number. It's a dull number. Don't you think so? So Ramanujan says, no, Hardy, no. It is not a boring number at all. It's the smallest number that can be expressed as the sum of the cubes of two positive numbers in two different ways.
Anyone can see that.
Okay, that's one way. So this was what Hardy told Ramanujan right away. Okay. And since then, you know, there's a whole study of these kinds of numbers, the taxi cab numbers as they're now called, okay, after this incident. So it's pretty funny how mathematicians get these things in their heads. No one knows. Who knows? The other wonderful story is about the Fibonacci sequence. Do you all know what the Fibonacci sequence is? If not, I will bore you for a few minutes with that, okay? So 0 and 1 are the first two numbers of the Fibonacci sequence. Leonardo of Pisa, not Leonardo da Vinci, but Leonardo of Pisa was the guy who was the inventor of these numbers. So 0 and 1. If I take the sum of 0 and 1, it's 1, right? Now I take the sum of 1 and 1, so I'm summing two numbers, the last two numbers in the series each time. I start with 0 and 1, but then I start summing these two numbers, and I get 2. Then I sum these two numbers, and I get 3. Then I sum these two numbers, and I get 5. And I sum these two numbers, and I get 8. And I sum these two numbers, and I get 13. Right? And I sum these two numbers, and I get
21.
This is called the Fibonacci sequence. okay? This sequence of numbers. Now you would think, what on earth is this useful for?
Right.
But it turns out that the seeds in a sunflower are arranged in sequences of Fibonacci numbers. Okay?
Who figured that out?
There's a host of things like this that you can learn if you just use Google and look over there.
The chambered nautilus is
Yes, there's tons of different things in nature. Okay? Leaf patterns, seeds in flowers, arrangements of different things that follow this Fibonacci
How
sequence.
do you spell that?
I'll write it. Fibonacci. Fibonacci.
Fibonacci.
Even now.
Fibonacci.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank
Okay?
Grazie.
Prego. So this is one of those amazing things that you learn, you start to see when you look at numbers, is that they are everywhere and they're all around us in different ways. And people have been pondering these things for a long time. And it's really an inexhaustible store of riches that we have to think about and entertain ourselves with if we so choose, right? Okay, any other thoughts, questions?
We used to have a member here, Jim Hummel,
Uh-huh.
passed away right after I got here.
Yeah.
But he was a professor at
Yeah.
University of
Yeah,
Maryland.
yeah.
He did lots of stuff with numbers
Yes.
and numbers and music
Absolutely.
and he was quite
Yes.
brilliant about these things too.
Yeah. So music is intimately related to numbers. And many mathematicians are musicians and, you know, it's really great.
George Goldenbaum was also a member here, and he
Yes,
was in the physics
yes,
department. He
yes.
maybe still teaches a course on
Occasionally, yes, yes.
the physics of music.
Yes, yes. So there are two courses in the physics department which are really interesting. One is the physics of music, and the other one, which I teach a lot, is called Seeing the Light, the physics of light. So it's to non-science majors, and I call it Seeing the Light, and it's about optics, vision, photography, and things like that for non-science people. And we use no equations whatsoever in those classes. But I take lots of equipment with me to those lectures. And we look at that equipment and we ask people, what is that thing going to tell us when we do this to it? Okay? The same kind of question, right? If I do this to it, what is it going to tell me? It's in periodic motion. Why is it going to do something different when it does that? Okay? So we ask questions of the apparatus and then try to see how it answers us. And are we okay with our mental pictures and models that we have constructed before we actually get the equipment? So I think of scientific equipment and apparatus as living entities, which we can ask questions to and which they answer, if we are gentle with them and if we behave correctly with them.
Yeah, you mentioned that according to Ramanujan's
Yes.
faith, he wasn't allowed to cross the ocean.
Initially.
Yeah, so where do arbitrary constraints imposed by religion come from?
Yeah. So I've often wondered, where do our, it's not just religion, prejudices and bigotries, I think these are all filters. Filters in our minds that we construct about thoughts, right? We have so many thoughts, and we need filters. We seriously need to filter our thoughts before we put them into words or actions. This is part of what our whole educational process is. You can see a movie like Lord of the Flies, right? And remember what happens to those kids on that island, you know, when they have no filters, right? is disastrous.
Pigs.
Yeah, so we need filters in our brains all the time. But sometimes we apply those filters indiscriminately or in ways that are governed by our fears. And I think part of this whole thing about not crossing the ocean or not eating beef or, you know, whatever religious constraints that one has in Hinduism. There's just as many in Christianity, just as many in Islam, any religion that you can think of, okay? There are strange constraints and customs, cultures that are built up. And I think the ability to think about these filters and whether they're the appropriate ones or not change with time, with our reference frame. As time has progressed, certain filters and ways of thinking have changed. Having slaves was common in the time of the Bible. Okay. No longer. Okay. Everything, I think, progresses, our reference frames change, and we change the filters that govern our lives and our structure together. And at some point we wonder, how could there have been such a crazy filter that we set out to isolate ourselves and say, no, you cannot cross the ocean because you will lose such and such aspect of your religion if you do that. You cannot marry such and such a person. Some filters are very important. You know, inbreeding and other things you do not want to propagate. Those filters are there throughout Leviticus. You can read about these filters, 613 commandments, 348 of them are positive ones, and 348 are, I think I said it the wrong way, 300 something are negative commandments, 200 something are positive commandments. Okay, but we do all of these kinds of things, right? Those are filters. Those laws are basically filters of behavior and words and so on. And I think we've got to examine from time to time, re-examine for ourselves what our own filters are. What attitudes do I have that I haven't really thought about seriously enough? Do I encourage my women graduate students the same way that I encourage my men graduate students? Do I give them the same opportunities, or do I have inbuilt prejudices in my heart and in my mind about what I expect of them or not? Okay. I got to think about these things. What are my filters? My prejudices, my shortcomings in this regard. Okay. So I think we constantly have to keep reevaluating. It's the scientist's method, right? You keep observing and changing your filters according to how. So I think that's part of what I would say existed and still exists in every religious tradition.
So in that vein, I mean, one of the strengths of science, as I understand it, is that it's self-correcting
Yes.
because of the scientific method. And we've gone off on tangents, and then evidence, was gathered, and those hypotheses were thrown out, or even theories. Do you think the great religions, faith, theology maybe, is self-correcting?
Absolutely. I think that. Okay.
I do too. I believe that.
I think that also. And my sense is that each one of us is like a piece of equipment in a lab, if you like. Okay? I have sensors that are built into me. I hear, I see, I think, I touch, I smell, all of those sensors that we know we have. But I think one very important sensor that we lose track of through our limited scientific perspective sometimes is this sensor of being aware of God's presence. And that sensor for God's presence in our lives, I think, comes through prayer, through meditation. Those are the traditional disciplines by which we have learned how to tune our minds and bodies to be receptive to God. And this to me is so important. It's an integral part, I think, of each of us and as collective groups to develop these sensing mechanisms. So when we are gathered together, how do we sense God's presence with us right here? Is God here with us? Is He speaking to us through each one of our questions, our thoughts, whatever we are thinking perhaps on our own? Okay. God does this all the time, I think. All the time. And we have to understand what filters and barriers we have built in our minds to remove God from our presence. We try to shield ourselves from God's presence, and the 139th Psalm, I think, says this so well. You know, I can go to the depths to try and escape from you, God, but you are there. You know, I'm never away from you. And I think when we learn how to sense God's presence, gradually through our being guided by God to do this, because that's the only source we have for learning how to do this, is God Himself or herself or whatever, right? Teaching us how to do it. Through Christ, through the Holy Spirit, whatever means God has of doing this, God teaches us to be present when God speaks to us and to listen. And my sense is that that is constantly evolving. It's never static. It's an ongoing dynamic process that is happening with each one of us. Whether we are aware of it or not, we are learning to listen to God's voice in different ways through our lives. And the more we become aware of this, the more, I think, in some ways, we gradually start to understand each other, to be conscious of each other's difficulties, problems, questions of empathy, and questions of love really come to the fore. And to me, I think it's constantly changing and evolving, and I see over thousands of years of human history that it has really gotten a direction. It's not directionless. It's progressing in certain ways. And it's not... So one of the people who's written a very recent book about God, have any of you read this guy, Rob Bell?
Yeah. Love is the answer.
That's one. But his latest book is another one. This is his latest book. So, what we talk about when we talk about God. And that book, he says, so I'll give you my 3-sentence summary of it. He says there are 3 words that you need to think about. One is God with us. With. God is always with us. And this is what I meant by saying that when Job was suffering, God didn't leave him alone. God was with him through that entire time, through that suffering. God is with us. God is for us, is the next thing he says. And God being for us means for our growth. God is our biggest lover. God loves us and nurtures us in the best way possible. God is always for us. God wants our growth, our development, constantly tugging us closer, is how I look at it. Fluctuating because of all our environmental noise and problems, but constantly being taken towards God. And God is ahead of us, is the third thing God says. Which means that God is not a God who is backwards in terms of scientific understanding or anything else. God understands science much better than we do.
Since God made it.
Since God made it.
Yeah, right.
So these are the things that I think he talks about in this book. They're pretty interesting. He makes a very nice argument and presentation about that. But I think those are three thoughts that I carried away from reading that book, which were kind of interesting. Yes.
I once read a book called Seeds to Civilization,
Yeah.
and two of the things that resonate with what we're talking about here are, the person talked about how humanity was able to gather seeds and plant and thus start to be stable rather than wandering around to get their
all the
food.
time. From
And then
nomadic
swing-
behavior
to stationary living.
Yes.
And that occurred around 10,000 years ago.
Yes.
To the fact that then religion came about 5,000 years after that.
It's not
Very
surprising.
interesting, yeah. And that, one of the things that he addressed too was the different basic crops that there were. And one of them was cassava.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly difficult to prepare so that it isn't poisonous to you. Yet there's the area where it grows, and that's what people used, and I always wonder, how in the world did they figure out how to prepare that? And it goes along with the scriptures we have that Chuck was asking about, are things that you don't do, and how you develop that, and how humanity developed those things.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that is so beautiful to learn about and discover as we go around the world on our travels, or we meet people here who come from other parts of the world. This is an amazing part of the country to be in for that purpose. We learn about so many things like this that are truly astonishing to us, right? About the foods we eat, the things we drink, the things that we talk about or don't, are so interesting, I think. As scientists, as people who are curious about life and customs and growth, I just realize how little I know. Speaking of food, I think it's a
I just wanted to mention one, as you were talking about the Holy Spirit and all that, reminded me
Yes.
of the most influential books I ever read. Theology
Yes.
is by an Anglican theologian named John B. Taylor. It's called The Go-Between God.
Uh-huh.
And the subtitle was The Holy Spirit in Christian Mission. And so he develops this whole theology where he says, just what you're saying, what makes any kind of a connection, whether it's in our minds or between two people or a group of people, that's, God is the go-between, so like a current that can make things happen, a illumination or insight or love or cooperation.
So, when the Big Bang happened, 14.8 billion years ago, people think, no, 13.8 billion years ago. This is the most current estimate.
Changing.
The most current estimate, according to the measurements from NASA.
Self-correct.
Self-correcting. They used to think it was 13.7. Now they've corrected it to 13.8, roughly. Okay, with plus or minus that many tens of millions of years. When the Big Bang happened, one of the things that we know this happened through is this thing called the background radiation. Okay. So there's radiation and energy that fills space almost uniformly, not quite, but almost uniformly is what we think right now. So this is called the cosmic background of the universe. Okay? And we can detect and sense this. This was detected and sensed totally by accident by two scientists at Bell Labs in the 1960s. And in 1964 they announced this. So Penzias and Wilson were their names. And they were building these radio telescopes. And they constantly heard this noise from this radio, not audible noise, but electromagnetic noise from these telescopes, and they had no idea where this was coming from. So at first they thought, well, the pigeons built their nest in this thing, in this part of this, and cleaned it out, and so on and so forth, the story goes. But eventually they found that it was coming wherever, everywhere. And part of it is if you remember our old black and white TVs, sometimes would have these random speckle patterns that would emerge on them. That part of it is the cosmic background. And so all of this stuff is there, permeating space. So in some ways, I guess the Hebrew word is ruach, right? For spirit. And this is this all-pervading, permeating spirit, in some sense, if you allow that scientific analogy, right? That is everywhere. It's within us. It's everywhere in the universe. It's the spirit of creation that is still there and detectable if we have the right instruments to look for it. But I believe very much in this ability to communicate without words that Hans Berger was thinking about and devoted his life to understanding. How did his sister know that something had happened to him? So I believe that we know very little about such phenomena, partly because scientists have been very cautious about exploring such things, that they cannot adequately explore with the measurement tools that they have right now. It'd be nonsense to do those kinds of things without the right tools. But as we learn better what tools we need, what problems we can explore that are not considered hard science now, maybe there'll be times in the future when we will really learn how to explore and understand things that we don't right now. Just as we do today things that 50 years ago would have been completely fiction, science fiction. And 2001 Space Odyssey is a wonderful example of that, right? I mean, it's just so many different ideas like that in that particular movie.
And just perhaps one, if I could be permitted, one other observation. Paul Tillich talks about when he's dealing with the question.
The ground of being.
Yeah, but I was gonna.
Right? Isn't that what he
but-
calls it?
Yes, that's his word for God.
Yeah.
But I was gonna talk about something else he talks
Yeah.
about, and that is trying to understand, the theodicy problem, the problem of evil and stuff. And his answer to that is that God created everything that is under the principle of freedom. And as you were doing this double
Yes.
pendulum thing here, I thought to myself, when you insert the second one, that's the principle of freedom. Now you can no longer control it, As long as it's one mechanical thing, maybe you can control it. But then you add the second one, and suddenly you have the principle of freedom, and you can't anymore determine what's going to happen. And that's kind of what's God's choice too. Either God could have created the universe as purely a machine, or in truly God's image, which is freedom. And once God has done that, then God has allowed for there to be evil and different languages and different, whatever, on and on.
No, that's really very interesting. In Hinduism, there's a thousands of years old debate. And people tried to understand this question of evil using two different ideas. So one was called dualism, right? And Christianity is non-dual, by the way, in my understanding of it. But in Hinduism, there was a branch which really tried to explain evil through a dualistic. So in Zoroastrianism, you have a fight between good and evil. In Hinduism, you had similar ideas that there's a center of good and a center of evil, and they're in constant battle with each other. And how this will evolve and come out, well, good will win over evil. But this is a long path, and a very difficult one. So, and then there's this is the dualist school. The other is the non-dualist or Advaitic school, which just means single school. So there is no duality. God is one. God is everything. And from that understanding, where we look at evil is the absence of God, in some sense. And so the interpretation of that is made in along those kinds of lines that really try to incorporate in one entity both kinds of things that happen. And the story of the Chinese farmer, whose son brought a horse to the village, and this horse was wonderful, but the horse escaped one day. And so everybody said, what an awful thing has happened. This horse has escaped. You've lost your horse. Terrible thing. A few days later, the horse comes running back into the village with a whole bunch of wild horses that accompany it. And then they said, oh, how wonderful. The horse went away, but it's now come back with all these great other horses, and we'll keep all of them and train all of them, and this will be great. So the young man whose horse it was starts to train them, and one day he falls off one of the horses and breaks his leg. And they say, oh, what a terrible thing has happened to you, you've broken your leg. And then, of course, just at that time, there's a war that starts up, and people are being taken into the army, but because he has a broken leg, he's not. So his father is enormously relieved, thank God.
That's known as the good news, bad news.
That little scenario is played out at the end of a movie called Charlie Wilson's War.
Yes, about this agent, right?
About this and about the American involvement in Afghanistan.
Yes,
and
yes.
the point seems to be that the political process is always indeterminate. And that would be my question for long reflection sometime. How much of the scientific process is indeterminate, and how much of it's determined, and where in the middle between those two things human life fits?
Yeah. I guess, Laplace thought everything was determinate, right? And he said that, if you give me the positions of every particle, I will tell you where the universe is going to be at a later time, right? And then that was classical deterministic physics, and it got completely destroyed with quantum physics coming up, right? And Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and so on and so forth. And we know that life is sort of at the middle of the scales. Right smack in the middle of the smallest things that we know in nature and the largest things that we know in nature is human life. The size of us, right? We are right smack in the middle of the most astronomical, the most microscopic objects that we know about. So I think we are right at the middle. We don't know very much about ourselves, particularly about our thoughts. We have very vague ideas about those things. So I think there's so much to be learned in all of that. And science is recognizing more and more that any system of logic is incomplete. It's not self-consistent. So we learned that in the 30s. Kurt Gödel started to talk about those kinds of things. So we have progressed a little bit in terms of understanding that we don't understand, and that oftentimes we can't prove things the way a mathematician proves things in science. And they're very different things, proof and logic constitute one part of our brain, rhyme or reason. We have two parts of our brain that are intimately connected. And I don't know how many of you have read this book called The Phantom Toll Booth.
My daughter loves that.
Okay, I love it too. It's a wonderful book. So Digitopolis and Dictionopolis are the two areas, and the princesses, rhyme and reason, have been captured and taken to the castle in the air. And Milo, the hero of the story, his quest becomes to rescue the princesses of rhyme and reason.
It's your
So,
Well, we can have more conversation over lunch. Let's give everybody. And perhaps we can have a grace, and then everyone can grab their lunch and